Good afternoon. My name is Pat Denner, and I want to welcome you here in the classroom and those watching on Zoom to this class on why do fireflies flash and how do they do it. Just a couple of items before we move on to the presentation. I want to remind attendees in the classroom that if they haven't already checked in at the front desk, to please do so that we can keep an accurate account of those attending. Also, I want to let you know there will be a pause in the presentation around midway for questions and answers. Those at home can put their questions in the chat. And for those here, please hold your remarks until I can pass you the mic so we make sure everyone can hear your questions. Our presenter this afternoon is our own HAS member, Dr. Kay Smalley. Dr. Smalley holds a BA from Rockford University in Illinois, as well as an MS and PhD from the University of Iowa. She retired from Emporia State University in Kansas, where she taught biology courses for many years and also conducted her own research into the behaviors of fireflies. As a child, Kay spent her summers in what I like to think of as kid heaven. Members of her family were instrumental in founding the Oxbow School of Art near the old mouth of the Kalamazoo River in Saugatuck. It was during her summers there, while the rest of her family was engrossed in artistic pursuits, that Kay became fascinated by the natural world around her and began to ask her own questions about why creatures behave the way they do. Maybe there's a child in most of us who at one time tried to capture fireflies in a jar in an attempt to better understand the magic that caused them to give flashes of light as the evening sky was darkening. I invite you once again to regain that sense of wonder and to finally get our questions answered about why and how are they able to do that. And with that, please give a warm HAS welcome to Kay Smalley.
Now, okay, you have to yell at me because who knows what stupid thing I'm going to do over here. It's been 20 some years since I've been in a classroom on this end of it anyway. As Pat said, hopefully you are all familiar with fireflies. I think almost everybody is. If you didn't catch them as a kid, your kids caught them, or your grandkids caught them, or whatever. Everybody goes out and catches them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about those kinds of fireflies that you're all familiar with. I am not going to do some of the things that this lady does. This is a book and it's in my references, so you can get a copy of it if you want it. Well, I think he's actually sending it out. It's called Fireflies, Glowworms, and Lightning Bugs, and it's by Lynn Frierson Faust, and I'll just keep saying, and Faust says, and Faust says. So if she knows a lot more about it than I do. It's been a long time since I've actually worked with fireflies. But she has a number of things in there that I'm not going to talk about, so I ought to warn you. There are fireflies that have no light in the daytime. The definition of a firefly that she uses is one that has a light sometime in its life cycle. So all fireflies almost that she's talking about have a light maybe when they're little or larvae, but not when they're adults. And those that don't have it are daytime fireflies, and I don't know anything about them, or not much anyway, so I'm not going to talk about them. I'm also not going to include fireflies that glow. There's a kind of a definition thing there, but I like to think of if it doesn't give a quick flash, or at least it's done in about a second or two, it's not a flash, it's a glow. And so there are some critters that do the glowing bit, and I'm ignoring them too. So you're getting a very much slimmed down view of fireflies. If I'm talking about it, it's something that goes around in the nighttime and flashes at you. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So what are those guys doing out there? A brief summary would be very simple. What you see flying around are the boys, and they're flying around and flashing their lights. And the girls are down in the ground, or at least down below the boys somewhere. And they're saying to her, hey, look at me. Aren't I cute? And she looks up and says, maybe. And if she does, then she'll flash back at him. So that there is then an exchange of signals between the male and the female until ultimately they get together and mate. So the whole purpose of why do fireflies flash really is it has to do with their mating behavior so that they can continue the species. However, it is a little bit more complex than I make it sound, because there are lots of different species of fireflies, and they do a lot of different things. And I've already skipped the next slide, but I'll tell you about it anyway. This is the outline, and I should, let's see, I'll do it over here so you guys can't see. Well, there's more people over here. I'll do it over here so they can't see. I'm basically going to go through this as I've just done, sort of an overview, what all is going on there. And then I'm going to talk about the genus Photinus, and I'll tell you who the genus Photinus is. But there are basically two genera, which means genus. Plural of genus, genus is genera. There are two genera that I'm going to talk about. There's only one more besides the ones I'm going to talk about that does the flashing bit. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about some of how they do this. And then that's when I'm going to pause. And then I'm going to talk about the genus Photurus, which is much more complicated. The reason I'm going to talk about this guy first, the Photinus, is because it's reasonably easy to understand it. When you get to these guys, and those are the ones that the ladies up here want to know why the fireflies in the dishes aren't flashing at them. And there are, if you haven't seen them, there are a couple of dishes of live fireflies being passed around. So if anybody wants them, anybody not seen them? Anyway, these guys here, you will see, if you put them in a dish, they'd run around and flash for you, which would make you much happier. So, and then we'll talk about them, and then I'm going to, actually, I've changed this so the questions are up earlier. And then I'm going to talk about how do they do it. And that involves some information about the structure and function of the light organ on the firefly. Okay, so this is a video that I'm going to show you that was made at the University of Florida by the guy who everybody calls the Firefly Doc, because he knows more about the behavior of fireflies than anybody. And believe me, there are lots of people that know a lot more about it than I do. I just happen to have gotten in on it on a long time ago. So here's Dr. James Lloyd, and he's going to tell you a little bit. He's the Firefly Doc. He's going to tell you a little bit about, I don't know how I hide now, how some of the same stuff.
That twilight firefly with the bright yellow flare, everybody sees it. It's part of us.
The blinking lights of fireflies or lightning bugs are summer's gift to people everywhere. But their gleaming display is actually a complex language of light that still puzzles scientists.
So little is known about biology of fireflies. What on earth are they doing out there? Why should some little beetles with a brain smaller than the head of a pin be wired to do these things in such a complex fashion?
What we do know is that fireflies are beetles, and they produce their own light to communicate with each other and with predators. The firefly glow is a chemical reaction triggered by oxygen in the firefly's light organ. The fire is a cold light that's nearly 100% efficient because, unlike our light bulbs, none of the energy is wasted on heat. Chemicals in fireflies taste awful, and the gleam signals predators to stay away. At the University of Florida, Gainesville, Mark Branham and James Lloyd study firefly communication, behavior, and evolution.
There are more species of fireflies in Florida than in any other state.
In fact, there are over 2,000 species of fireflies worldwide, with distinct flash patterns, time, shapes, and colors. In most cases, male fireflies use flash patterns to attract females so they can mate and lay eggs. The females wait on the grass and respond back if they're interested.
Females are going to be picking males on the basis of certain sorts of features. How well the nervous system is functioning might be one thing.
For the most part, the secret flash codes of fireflies depend on the amount of light in the sky.
Fireflies partition up the evening into certain blocks of time. It's like acts of a play. Different species come out one after another. They don't have a watch, so all of this is truly gauged on how dark it is.
The most common species in the United States is the Photinus pyralis, or Big Dipper firefly. It begins flashing at dusk in a yellow-green J-shaped pattern every 6 seconds to court the females below. With each firefly species communicating at different times with unique codes and different colors, there are many variations and outliers. Some fireflies synchronize their flashes, others don't glow at all. The female Photurus has a more sinister use for her flash.
What these females do in one of their primary methods of hunting is to imitate the flash responses of females of other species, call these males into them with these phony signals, and then they eat them.
Even as we learn more about firefly communications, their lights are going out. Excess street lighting, pesticides, and development could all be impacting a firefly's ability to find mates and reproduce.
Okay, I said I was going to talk about Photinus and Photurus, and all of you are thinking, oh my gosh, is she going to get into a whole bunch of that? But I think if you want to identify them, you can tell the difference. Can you tell the difference between these two fireflies? Yeah. Well, the Photinus, that guy over there, is, I think of him, they're beetles, as they said in the thing. They're beetles, and this thing is the wing covers. All beetles have wing colors. You think of ladybugs or something like that, that have their hard, kind of a hard shell on them. And so with the Photinus, they have a black and shiny. And so I go Photinus tiny, you know, something to help me. Black and shiny, these wing covers, the elytra. And then this thing is usually a darker spot in it, so are these. And then this is Photurus. And they're a little bit more variable. I think you can tell a Photinus anytime you pick one up because it's always black and shiny, even if you have no idea what species it is. But the Photurus tend to be, most of them are brown, and they have these extra, their wing covers are a little more decorative, shall we say, than these black things over here. So that these are fairly easy to recognize too, if you catch them, which I have not been able to do. So the ones that are going around in the dishes are all this guy over here. Or they're two different kinds of photinus. Okay, well, I think what you got, I hope, from the video is that there are a lot of different species. And if there are a lot of different species, then the flash patterns or flash codes that he was talking about have to be different for different species so that the male attracts the proper female and the proper female goes to find the proper male. Well, I was going to say that if you pick one of these things up, I hope now, black and shiny, photinus. And otherwise it's photurus. There is another one that you might run into, but I've only run into one of them in my entire life. So I kind of gave up on them. All right, here are some of the kinds of flash patterns that you may see. And, you know, when you're out in the field, I guess I could give you guys a chance over here. When you see these guys out in the field, you probably don't notice. What you just notice is they're out there flashing, right? But they have definite codes, as the video said. This is a, whoopsie, did it wrong. This guy up here, single flashes, and there's a timeline down here. So he gives a single flash and then another one about 10 seconds later. So he's kind of slow with this. I think, by the way, that one of the species that I'm passing around might be that guy. This other guy gives two of them. Now, you'll notice that those are both within the first second or two. So sometimes it might be difficult to see the two different flashes. But then 5 seconds later, he gives another two and so on down the line. So these guys are all cruising around saying to the girls, here I am. Am I your guy? Am I your guy? Then it gets more complicated. This guy, another photinus, this one we'll talk about a little bit later because these fireflies synchronize and there's a big deal about them in the Great Smoky Mountains. So, but they give anywhere from 4 to 6 flashes. When you have a bunch of them like that, it's called a flash train. And if I use that term, that's what I mean. They're just all bunched together. And then about 10 seconds later, he gives another one. I'm going to ignore this guy in the middle for a while. And then I'm going to talk about this Photinus pyralis. That's the one that they said was the most common firefly. And I'm going to show you some more pictures of Photinus pyralis. And I know there's one set of Photinus pyralis that I'm passing around. Let's see. These guys, he said they have kind of a J-shaped flash about every 5 seconds, like that. This is because as the male is flying, he flies like this, he's flying along, and then he goes up. And then as he goes up, he turns the light on. So then he comes down again, and then he goes up, and he turns the light on again when he goes up. So every time he goes like this and goes up, that's why they call him the Big Dipper, because that's the way he flies, is because he flies like a dipper. So another way of doing it, I tried this, but I don't know if it'll work. If you assume that the firefly is flying along here, and then he turns his light on as he goes up, it goes like that, and he's done. And then he goes along a little later and tries it again. Is it coming on? Okay, so, but that's why it shows off that way. And I will talk a little bit more about him in a minute because I've got some. The next slide actually is trying to do that. The first one I showed you was highly diagrammatic. These are some things that have been put together by Dr. Lloyd. It's published in the University of Michigan occasional papers or something like that. But it shows you the patterns of 9 different fireflies, most of which are Photinus. But if you're going to try and really figure out some of these things, you really need to be able to have a camera or slow motion thing, or be able to open up your lens and let the firefly move along, and then you can see the different flashes so that you can separate out some of these things. Okay, this is Photinus pyralis, and I do think the one that's in the rectangular or the kind of longitudinal, it's rectangle rather than square. Those are Photinus pyralis. I caught them in Freedom Village lawn last year. I was really surprised. I hadn't done anything with fireflies for years. And I said, well, I'll go see if I can find any. So I walked out, and the right time of night, these guys fly at dusk, which is one reason why they're the ones that all the kids catch, or adults too. I caught them. But when they go up like this and it's only dusk and they're flying up there, they're silhouetted against the light. So that's where the kids can reach up and grab them. And they do. So do I. But that's the way they flash. And that's the way these guys live on lawns. That's another reason they're the most frequently caught one, because they're liable to be almost anywhere in your yard or in your neighborhood or something like that. You don't have to go out in the woods and everything and hunt them down, because they're very yard friendly. And okay. Their signal, as I said, is that upward flash. And the female responds, she's down here on the grass, and she'll respond, and it's really at a set time after the male. Basically how he reckons, she's smart. She knows that's a male of her species, but he knows that if anything flashes after a certain length of time after his flash, that's her. And it's very easy to take a flashlight and attract males of this species, because if you they don't care if it's bright. I mean, the brighter the better, you know. It must be a good female. Anyway, they flash up at him the right length of time, and then so he flies and he tries to get closer to her, but she is not quite as particular as they would let you believe, because, well, she's exchanging signals with one guy. Another one comes along and she says, oh, he looks good. So she starts exchanging signals with another one. And so when you go and see, like I did when I went out and tried to find these guys, when you go out and look for the female, she will frequently have 4 or 5 males around her, and they're all down there kind of, is it me? Is it my turn? Is it my turn? And eventually they do think she mates with at least one of them, obviously, but sometimes she mates with 2 of them. So she's spreading out the genome that way, I guess, a little bit. Anyway, I was real pleased with myself to walk out after years of not doing fireflies and go out and find these 2 guys. I actually found a female too. So how do you know when it's a female? You turn it over and you look at the light organ. So here's the light organ. In the male, it takes up 2 full segments. And there's another male over there. And then the female, it just takes up part of one. Oopsie, wrong button. Here it is, and you'll see that it just takes up part of one segment. So she's easy to recognize from that. Another thing that you should probably know about female fireflies, especially genus Photinus, is that the females tend to look, she looks a little fat there, maybe. It's because, of course, she's stuffed full of eggs. That's her business, is to perpetuate the species out there. So This female does have wings. And you can just barely see them on the back of her. They come down to about here. So they're not quite as long as the males, but they're good sized wings. And she can fly on this particular species. Other females of the Photinus, these different species, the female is very much reduced in size. In fact, sometimes she has very tiny wings, can't fly at all. Other times she has no wings at all, and all she is a bag of eggs with a light organ attached. So the next slide, I went and caught this guy out by my cabin in the woods near Saugatuck. So it's a different habitat completely, and it's a different firefly, but it's some sort of Photinus because it's black and shiny. It's also much smaller than the previous ones. The previous ones run around 15 millimeters long. This guy runs around 9 or 10 millimeters long, so he's considerably smaller. Unfortunately, I did not find the female of this species because finding the female really helps you figure out what species it is, because if she's one of these wingless things or one of these things with much reduced wings and stuff like that, that helps you a lot cut down on what species you're looking at. I went back there last week, and I thought I would catch some more of these guys so that maybe I could make a better picture so you could see the difference in size between these guys. Well, they weren't there anymore. There was another species out there. So I didn't say that in that video, but that's true. Some of them will come out earlier in the year and others will come out later in the year. So this one had disappeared. I caught this guy in June sometime, and I went out there in maybe the second week in July to see if I could catch another one, and they weren't there, but there may have been some, but I couldn't catch them. These guys were much easier the ones that are circulating around in the thing with the green top. Those are the ones I caught instead. They're a little bit bigger than these guys were. So they're definitely a different species. They also have different markings on them, which I could tell apart when I looked. When I do things like that, I look it up in here. So Photinus pyralis, unknown species, and I guess that's it. Then the third one, Photinus, I want to tell you about. Let's see. This is another video, so we probably can't see much of anything right now. So I'm going to go back so you can see. The third one I want to tell you about has synchronous flashes. Now, this is something unusual. Back when I was a graduate student, the only fireflies that were known that had synchronous flashes were found in Thailand. And so my major professor went out with some other fireflyologists, as they call themselves, to look for them. And there they say that what happens, I haven't seen them, so I can't tell you, but what they say happens is that they'll cluster on a tree and the whole tree will go off at once, all the fireflies in there, and then another tree will go off and stuff like that. Well, we don't have any of these, but they have found synchronous fireflies in the United States and Mexico. In the Great Smoky Mountains, they actually have a program to go out and watch the synchronous fireflies there. I don't know, somebody's nodding their heads, but some of them you can go out there, and what they do, it's so popular, in fact, that what happens is that they have had to, in order to protect the fireflies in the habitat, they have had to limit the number of people that can come out during that period of time. And they do it by having a lottery. You put your name in to this site on their website, you put your name in, and if you're lucky, you might be one of the people that actually gets to go and watch it. So they do have that, and the female, excuse me, what they do is they limit it to 100 people a night, and there's about 7 days in late May or early June when they can actually do it. So about 700 people get to watch this spectacle. And I've got a video, but it doesn't show the spectacle. I think they want us all to go out and do this, put our names in and go watch the fireflies in the Great Smoky Mountains. This is the National Park Service that runs this program, by the way. So while I was trying to find one, and I watched a lot of videos, trying to find one that actually showed the synchronous fireflies, I ran across another one that was taken in Tlaxcala, Mexico. And at the time that the next video that I'm going to show you was actually recorded, it wasn't a very well-known spot. Since then, it too has sort of gotten itself more touristy and attracted more people. So there is a later video, but I thought this one was the best. So I hope you can see it. And I'll let you get a little bit dark adjusted, and then I'll start this thing. This is more amateur than the more recent one, but it shows more what happens.
I don't even really have words right now. This is one of the most incredible things I've seen. I've been a lot of places, 50 countries. I've seen a lot of things, but this firefly show is one of the most amazing things on this planet. It's amazing how they all synchronize. All the males trying to compete with each other. I can't believe this happens on planet Earth.
One of the problems with doing stuff like this is that you don't have all the fireflies in the same plane. So although it looks pretty good, I think, for the synchronicity of these things, some of them are around the trees from each other and so forth. So some of them are back in, they get a little bit out of whack. But isn't that cool? I really think it's cool. I don't know what species that is. I'm assuming it's another Photinus because the one at the Great Smoky Mountains is, but the one in Thailand isn't. It's another species. So who knows? They just didn't seem to be willing to give that. So you might ask, or maybe you won't, maybe you're not interested, but I am. Why do they do that? Why do they do that, for heaven's sakes? Well, where they have been discovered, where these synchronous fireflies have been discovered, there's always lots of fireflies. So as they're flashing around, why do they do it that way? And you think about it, what would happen if they tried one-on-one, if there are thousands of fireflies all flashing at the same time? You know, this boy goes off and this girl answers it, but then there's all these other guys over here going off, and then this. So they believe that what's happened is that it's an evolutionary thing that they have basically evolved, so that they're all flashing at once. Well, actually, they're not flashing at once. They're all flashing, doing their own kind of flash, and then they stop. They all stop at once. And in that pause, the female can and does respond. So they go off, she responds. They go off, and she responds. So the girls have their own little time span in there between the multiple flashes of the boys doing this synchronous thing. And so exactly how it occurred, one doesn't know, but you could see where it would make more sense from the standpoint of evolution, standpoint of survival of these species, is if they are going to do this way instead of group behavior, instead of doing it, trying to do one-on-one. Okay. Now somebody's going to say, what happens to the fireflies in the wintertime? Well, the fireflies die. But they have a complex life cycle. It's kind of like butterflies, you know, butterflies go around, you got the caterpillar for a while, and then they could turn into a chrysalis, and then out comes a beautiful butterfly from a caterpillar. Well, the same thing is happening here. It's relatively common in the insect world. It means it's called complete metamorphosis. So here's the adult phase. And in this particular one, you've got a photinus male. And here's one of these females that I said is very much reduced. It doesn't show it very well. It's not the best picture in the world, but she has very much reduced wings. So that's still an adult female. They only live for 3 to 4 weeks, they say. I don't know what has happened to the ones out that I found, that first firefly I showed you from out in Saugatuck. They were gone, certainly, are mostly gone in the 3 weeks between the time that I first picked them up and the time I went back to look for them again. So 3 to 4 weeks is certainly a maximum. So this is basically the time in the life cycle when you've got an adult, this little red patch here. Then the adults lay the eggs, and the eggs are eggs and developing for about 3 weeks. And then about this point, a little tiny larva hatches out. Now this is a big larva here. This is a finished product here, but they hatch out. Now, if you remember anything about insects, they have a hard outer part to their bodies. So they can't grow without shedding their skins. So as these little guys here in the larval phase, as they grow and get bigger and bigger, periodically they have to shed their skin so that they can pump themselves up and look a little bit bigger and then grow some more. These things are interesting. The larvae of the photinus species are actually in the ground. I've only seen one of them in my life, and it was in my mother-in-law's backyard a long time ago. They are hard to see because they're actually in the ground, but they're down there and they're eating their way through snails and grubs and worms and everything else that you could think of that's down there in the ground. And so that's what they're doing. And then they grow, of course, and that takes up most of the rest of the year. And that's where they are in the wintertime. They're in this larval stage and they're down in the ground. Now, most of them, depends on where they live. In Florida, where Dr. Lloyd worked, the larva probably takes about a year to get through this whole stage. In Michigan, presumably, they take the 2-year period because there's not as much of a growing season. And so during this time, they're down there suspended animation, so to speak, or feeding themselves, whatever. And then when that gets done, here we go, like butterfly does the chrysalis stage, they do a pupal phase. These guys come to supposedly they're supposed to come to the surface of the ground, but I've never found them. So they're probably still below the surface, and they turn into a pupa. It's a chrysalis stage for the butterfly. And that takes about 3 weeks. And then we've got an adult stage and go through the whole cycle again. Now, I have never seen these larvae. I have seen them for Photurus, because Photurus, this is essentially the same cycle for both species. This is shown for Photinus, but Photurus, the brown firefly, the nasty one that the females eat other fireflies. The larvae are actually, I have found them and other people have found them on mud at the edge of a pond. That's where they go and they're eating the things that are there for them. Snails, sometimes some other insect larvae and so forth. And I forgot to mention that these things do have a light organ. The fireflies do. I don't have a picture here, I guess. But they have two little tiny light organs on one segment in the posterior end. And so in the fall, late summer, fall, I have gone out and caught these larvae of the Photurus. They're crawling around on the mud and they light up while they're crawling around so that you can actually see them. You still have to go catch them, which can be a kind of a messy business, but nevertheless, they're out there and you can catch them. And I have brought them into the lab then, and they will turn into a pupa, give them the proper amount of muddy whatever that they like, and they build themselves a little house. We call it an igloo, but it builds themselves a little house out of the mud that covers them up while they pupate. So I've followed them through this in the lab. Okay, I think, yeah, this is where your first question period is. What do you want to know? Yes, ma'am.
Do adults eat, or are they like some walks that don't eat?
There's been a lot of controversy about there. When the question was, do the adults eat? And in Photinus, that's been a question. When I was a student, everybody said, no, they don't eat. They don't eat. The Photinus males don't eat. One day I was working with a bunch of them in my lab, and so a bunch of them were crawling around on the table, and I happened to have a little dish that had sugar water in it, and doing something else, completely ignoring them. And I looked up and here they all were sitting there around this little dish of sugar water, slurping it up. So I began to feed them thereafter. And Dr. Faust, the book that I mentioned, she said that she has begun to feed hers too. She gives them a little slice of apple, and there's a little slice of apple in the ones that are going around. So, of course, the female Photurus do eat, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they eat the boys. Yeah, in the back there.
I've had the privilege of seeing the synchronicity in the Smokies,
Oh, did you?
but my daughter lives near Howell, Michigan, and she has a row of trees behind her house, and the synchronicity was there in those trees. It was just marvelous.
It's cool. Yeah, I'm not surprised. She can make a lot of money. She wants a lot of people to come. Marilyn, right
Were
here.
you saying, Kay?
I got the,
I'm sorry.
mic.
Do I recall that you said that if you were to just hold out a flashlight, they might be attracted to come toward you?
I can get the males of the Photurus pyralis, yes,
Okay.
Photinus pyralis to come to me. Yes,
Thank
I
you.
have.
I'm going to try that.
I actually had, I had some in a lab one time, and they were sitting in a jar. And so I was making signals at them if they flashed. Photinus don't like to flash in the jars very well. but they will. And yeah, it's not hard. A lot of people have done it because they don't seem to care how bright your flashlight is. I mean, you can use a big flashlight and they, oh boy, there's a big one. Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah.
Okay,
Pat?
I have a question. What's the difference between a firefly and a lightning bug?
There is no difference. It's the
There is
same
no
thing. It's
difference.
just a different term. Different parts of the country, they call them lightning bugs, and other fives, we call them fireflies. And fireflies is sort of the thing that the people who study them have come to adopt, but a lot of people call them lightning bugs. Not a big deal. Oops, here's another one.
So where do they lay their eggs?
They lay their eggs on the ground or in the ground. They'll lay their eggs under a rock or something on the ground, and then they will hatch. I mean, if they live like the ones that are living in the woods out where I live, or where I used to live, they will get a little bit under the leaves and stuff, but they'll lay their eggs right on the ground. Yeah, it's not a big deal. Of course, I've never seen any, so I can't. I can only tell you what other people tell me.
Okay, I was interested in their feet. They have these little 3-part toe-like
Mhm.
features. Is there any story on that?
Not
Do
that I
they-
know of.
Do they cling to twigs or
Well,
grasses?
yeah, I mean, the females especially are going to grab onto things, but the males do too. And in the daytime, when it's light outside, these guys that I've been passing around, they've been on the edges of you noticed them, they were on the edges of the containers. They're not flying. No, they're just crawling up there. Yeah.
I'm curious, what do fireflies do except flash at each other? What is their purpose other than that?
What is their purpose?
Mhm.
They're entertaining.
Okay. Well, they must not be very good food if they don't taste good.
No, they don't taste good at all. No. What's that? Birds generally no. What bats do? Well, once they learned, most animals, mammals, dogs, cats, and so forth, we'll leave them alone. Yeah, they get eaten by other insects. They get eaten by spiders. And so more of the invertebrate type things feed on them. But apparently when you get more refined, you don't like the taste of them.
People in my neighborhood, Kay, have been spraying quite a bit for mosquitoes. And I am worried that that's impacting the firefly population. Is that one of the things that's
What's part of it?
affecting
Yeah.
their
Mhm.
life cycle?
Right. And the other thing is the habitat for the young. Since they spend most of their lives as larvae in the ground, anything that gets on the ground or that gets, that's sprayed on the ground, or a lot of things that get sprayed on the ground, is also hard on the larval stage. In fact, many people, what was it they tried to do in the ones in Thailand? They went out and they thought, well, we're going to protect them. And they fixed up the area around these trees, but they neglected the fact that the larvae were not using the trees. They were all around. And so they were killing off some of those. And they've made a comeback, I guess. But I did find there was a video of some of them, but I don't know, they weren't as spectacular as I expected them to be. I liked the one I found. Anything else? Okay, well, then we're going to talk about Photurus. I said I've been talking about Photinus because it's a nice generalized firefly. Photurus, genus Photurus, are not. I have to admit that when I was in Kansas, I had a student and he worked on a species of Photurus. And actually I sent him off to get his PhD with Dr. Lloyd, and he did. And he's back now teaching at Kansas State University and working on the fireflies of Western Kansas. But that firefly that I worked on and that my student worked on is not typical, according to Dr. Faust, of most photourists. He was on these fireflies that we were working on were nice, gentle sorts. The females did not go around eating their males or other fireflies and things like that. But Dr. Lloyd has divided fireflies up into two main groups. There's only about 4 species that don't have, that act like that, kind of like Photinus. And then there's 17 or 18 of them that have this female femme fatale, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later, and those are the much more numerous kind. So I'm going to take her word for it and just talk primarily about the more numerous type of photourists. And I'm going to use her words too sometimes because she knows more about them than I do. There was one of those in Kansas that I did look at, but I could never figure out what it was doing. And you'll see why in a little bit. So anyway, this guy is a male photourist of these groups, the larger group. These guys, they almost look like it, don't they? Like they're getting ready to do something. This is she calls that the humpback posture, and she says it's typical of the males of this species. They fly fast, they walk fast. These are the ones that would entertain you girls that were disappointed because the fireflies weren't flashing in the things. If you put them in a jar, they will flash around. They will flash or walk or fly or whatever, and they'll flash and flash and flash as if they're really mad at you for confining them. I mean, they don't like that. So this is an entirely different type of behavior than what you see with the fireflies that I passed around, which are genus Photinus. Let's see. Oh, then I want to talk. Yeah. So they also have complex flash patterns. This is a relatively simple one, but what this little strip is, and I'm going to show you some more of these in a minute. This is a little 15-second strip, and it's a diagrammatic representation of what they're doing. So here they are over here in the first second, 3 little flashes, real fast flashes within approximately half a second. So the one of these that I didn't recognize in Kansas, I called the Photourus flicker flash because I had no idea what his name was or what species it was, but I just, because the flicker was so obvious, it was the one thing that was quite obvious to me. So, and then they repeat this like every 5 seconds in this particular thing. And that's the kind of, a lot of what they do. Okay. All right, there's a lot of, there's a lot of variety. These are some of the same things. This one up here is the same male at some point, and it's, I'm not going to say when. And then this one is also, and then this is just a single male, and this is just a single male. So this single flash is very characteristic. They can all do it though. So if you're looking at them and trying to figure out what in the world they're doing, it has to be regular for you to think this is every 3 seconds approximately. So it's fairly regular. So maybe he's talking about something other than he's mad at you, or that the wind is blowing him around, or that you're trying to catch him or something like that. But this same male can have one of these flicker flash things. And you see that that's at a different rhythm than the single flashes. He's doing this about every 5 seconds, whereas he did the single flashes every 3 seconds. So the question then comes, when's he talking to the girls? I don't know. That's why I never figured out the one in Kansas that I saw. I never figured out when he was talking to the girls. But here's some other things, and these are all ones that have been seen in these Photurus species, males. Here's one that does the flash thing, like we saw one in Photinus that did that, and then they may be four. This one kind of indicates that he didn't really do very well on his fourth flash, and so forth. And that's at a every 5 to 6 second interval. He also does a flicker flash, and it looks like it's a little different than this one up here, for example. So is that a different species? Good question. Then some of them do these things. This is a 2 second long flash. I would almost get that into the glow category, but he repeats it every 6 or 7 seconds. And here's one that likes to do the dot dash thing, dot dash, dot dash. And so it's a 2 second long thing with a single flash and then this glow thing going on. So what in the world are they doing? Well, as I said, I don't know. Dr. Faust has, well, let me go to the next slide before I say anything more. Okay, this is the male and female in Photurus. So here we have, oopsie, don't do that, Kay. Here we have the 2 segment light organ in the male, and these 2 should be the same size. This is just a bad slide on my part because I didn't match them very well. And here's the female. She's also got a 2 segment light organ, but it doesn't take up the whole segment. So you can tell the males and females apart, but the females are just as active as the males. So unlike the Photinus ones that we said that don't even have any wings or something, and they're just sitting there basically being a hatchery, these gals, darn. These gals, they're slender. They don't even look like they were full of eggs like the other ones did. And they're very, very active. They also are the ones that do the female femme fatale thing. So here is another example of a female Photurus eating a male Photinus. And as the video said, a lot of people think that she can actually, smart little bug, I guess, I don't know, but she can imitate the flash patterns of the female of his species and draw him into her with what he called fake flashes. And then when he arrives, she eats him. So, you know, that's not good, but it happens. And she's really not particular. She does like the Photinus males best, I guess, but she will eat her own mate too. And she will eat other females or other male Photurus. So somebody asked me about what do they eat? Well, these gals eat other fireflies. So why do they do it? Let's see how I'm doing. One reason may be that she needs more food because she is so active. They're much more active than the Photinus were. But the other reason that at least the experts, and I'm not one, they say is that she's eating them to stuff herself full of those chemicals. Remember in the thing they said that those chemicals that make the fireflies taste awful? She's getting a good supply of those. And then when her eggs mature and she lays them, they're going to be full of those bad tasting chemicals. And as a result, it would make evolutionary sense for this behavior to occur, to put more of those bad tasting chemicals into her young, because then they're less likely to be eaten. And remember, these guys, do lay their eggs on the surface rather than down below the surface. So they're more likely to be predated. I don't know, can you do that? Than the other ones. So that's the theory. That's the kind of reason that they put forward to her having this kind of behavior. So the photuras are extremely difficult to figure out. And so Faust concludes her, she has a section called the disclaimer about photuras. She said, okay, you can't distinguish these species. I don't know if I said it or not, but the way you distinguish in many species of insect, the way you distinguish different species from one another has to do with the structure of the male genitalia. So you can't distinguish all of these photuras with all these different flash patterns. You can't figure it out. I mean, you can't distinguish them. As far as she's concerned, she said she's looked at them all, and as far as she's concerned, they're all identical. So are they just one species with a whole bunch of different patterns depending on where they live and what they do and so forth? Or are they really separate species? Well, she goes ahead and converts them into, so she goes ahead and decides, well, I think there's different species. And so she has converted them, or decided to put them into this category that I said earlier of these 17 things that all have a female femme fatale and lots of active fireflies in there. And so she does in her book, same book, she does in her book, divvy them up, and she describes different species based upon their behavior and the flash patterns. And she thinks sometimes that she actually knows when they're talking to the girls, which is more than I do. So but she's a naturalist. I mean, she works with these things all the time. This is her job. My job is to tell you about them. So I don't know the answer to that, but this is basically what she said. Okay, so now we're going to change the subject completely. I went to the University of Iowa to do my graduate work. I was interested in how do things work. You know, that's what I really kinds of questions I like to do. Although I guess I grew up being a naturalist sort of person, but when I went to school, I found it was very interesting to try and figure out how do these things work? What makes this stuff, what makes things like this happen? And how does our heart beat? How does all of those kinds of things? And so I had a lot of how-to questions. I went thinking that I was going to go into endocrinology, but when I got there, I met Dr. Emil Vici, who was in charge of the endocrinology group, and he decided that I was going to work on frogs. I was going to feed developing tadpoles hormones. And I wasn't overly happy with it, but I did. I did it, and I got my master's degree. But then I decided that this was more developmental biology than what I really wanted to do. So I went to visit, and I went to talk to the physiologist, or the animal physiologist, the comparative physiologist on the staff, Dr. Case, and I said to him, you know, could I do something with you for my PhD? And so he gave me a project in which I worked on the cockroach nervous system. Kind of icky, yes, but he got me a PhD. Unfortunately, when about the time I was ready to get that PhD, Dr. Case picked up and moved to the University of California, Santa Barbara. And so the University of Iowa hired me to teach his course, and he gave me his lab to work in. Well, he was a neurophysiologist, and what I had been doing for my PhD was all sorts of recording from nerves. And quite frankly, I didn't understand half the equipment that I was working. When he left, I went around and wrote down all of the settings on the thing, on all of that equipment, so that I could get back to it if I changed it and couldn't get back to it. So I wasn't really interested in that. But he had worked on fireflies. And so that's really when I got started on fireflies, was I decided, okay, I had finished my degree. I was just sitting there with a good lab for a year, and what could I do with fireflies? Well, one of the things I wanted to know was, well, okay, Dr. Case and his students had shown that you stimulate the nervous system and you can get the flash. So obviously the flash is under the control of the nervous system. So what do you do then? Well, you ask the question, the nervous system goes down and then it causes a lot of biochemistry. And everybody, about the time that I was doing this, the biochemistry had already been worked out by people grinding up fireflies and figuring out how the firefly light reaction worked in a test tube. And so I thought, well, okay, we know the biochemistry. How do we get from a nerve impulse going down to the biochemistry? Well, as I was beginning to think about all this, let me go back. So my first step was to try and figure out, when a nerve impulse arrives at some organ like a muscle or something like that, first thing it does is release a tiny amount of a chemical that goes across to the muscle cell and says contract, okay? And so we figured there was a tiny chemical in there that when the firefly said flash, or his, what did Lloyd call it? A brain that's smaller than the head of a pin. Okay, so once that nerve impulse gets down to the light organ, what happens first? So I went to try and I spent some time working on what was happening in there between the nerve impulse and the light organ. Well, I found out that I determined the nature of the chemical, but then one of his other students finally came up and said that the neurotransmitter, the chemical that transmits from the nerve ending to the light organ, was something called octopamine, which is comparable to some of the brain chemicals that you've heard about, dopamine, norepinephrine, things like that. So it's kind of comparable. In fact, it's made by the same pathway as norepinephrine is in us. But octopamine turns out to be a fairly common neurotransmitter in insects and other arthropods and so forth. So that was good. But still didn't tell me how that get to the biochemistry. I mean, here was this biochemistry stuff. So I hate to inflict this upon you, but it's my idea of a simplified version of the biochemistry. What you need in the firefly light organ is a light emitting compound, which is luciferin. That was named that years and years ago. It has no chemical meaning in this sense. I mean, it's been determined what the chemistry is and all that sort of stuff. And I could have shown you a whole bunch of chemistry, but I didn't want to. Anyway, you need that because that's the light emitting compound. You need an enzyme, and that enzyme is called luciferase. So it has to catalyze the reaction in which luciferin is going to give you the light. What you need when those two things join, you need ATP to get those two things to join, and that activates the luciferin. But it can sit around in an activated state until oxygen, free oxygen comes along, and then oxygen creates a change which causes the emission of light. So all you really need in terms of biochemistry is a light emitting compound, which we call luciferin, an enzyme, which is called luciferase, ATP, which is a universal energy compound in all living things, and oxygen, which, let's face it, we need it, just like the firefly does. So if we're going to figure out then what happens here, we need to know something about the light organ. So I apologize, but you're going to have to look at the anatomy of the firefly light organ. This is the stuff that I actually got into this with. So remember, when you looked at the firefly, the outside, you could see the light organ through the bottom, through the cuticle, the skin at the bottom. So this is the lower part of the ventral surface, if you let me use that, of the light organ. And this is where you're looking through it and seeing this light organ. Consists of 2 layers. This is the most diagrammatic thing I ever found, but it works. It's a dorsal layer. Don't ignore that for now. Here's the photic layer, or it's called the photogenic layer if you're a firefly. This diagram was made by somebody who didn't know anything about fireflies. But what you see that this is a section. The belly of the internal organs of the firefly are up here on top, and the outside world is down here. So you're cutting through from top to bottom in this organ. What is most conspicuous in the firefly light organ are these trachea. The whole light organ is organized around trachea. Does anybody know about trachea in insects? Okay. Insects, if we need oxygen for something we breathe in, we take it into our lungs, gets into the blood, and then the blood carries it. Insects don't do that. They have a whole system of air tubes that convey oxygen directly to the tissues. So let's see. So this thing is the trachea. It branches out here and here. Oh, let's see, it's labeled over here. These little things are little tiny tubes called tracheoles. They're just little air tubes. And this branching occurs within a structure called the end cell, which I'll get back to in a minute. Okay, what turns out to be strange about all of this, and the reason I'm putting you through this, is because the nerve, here's the nerve, and this green thing here, coming down here, and it doesn't end on these yellow things, which are the tissues that actually give you the light. They end on this tracheal end cell. Really weird. So if you're trying to figure out what goes between the nerve impulse octopamine and the biochemistry, you have to figure out what that little thing is doing, what that little end cell is doing in between the biochemistry, which is presumably out here in this stuff, and the nerve, because the nerve is ending on this cell here. Okay, now what I'm going to do, I'm really going to take this as fast as I can, believe me. But you take a section through here so that you're perpendicular to this slide. And so you're going to be looking down here, and we're going to be looking at these things, the nerve ending, the end cell, the trachea, and then we're going to look at the photogenic tissue. So, okay, so now we're looking down the trachea, one of those long tubes, bringing air down there. Here are the tracheoles coming out here, going out between these cells here, which are the cells that produce the light. And here's the nerve ending. right there where these things branch out and go between the cells. So what's going on? Well, there are basically two theories now. I thought I was going to get, when I wrote the summary for this class, I thought I was going to get to the end, but found out I didn't get there. But what goes on then, there are basically two theories as to what is going on here. And they all depend on a rather unusual thing, and that is that there isn't enough oxygen for the light organ cells where the chemicals are. I forgot to mention where the chemicals are. Chemicals are all inside these little things here, all these little granules. I think they're labeled down here as peroxisomes. We call them photocyte granules. They're just simple things. That's where the luciferin and the luciferase are. So the chemical reaction is going to be in those little granules. So we've got all this oxygen, all this big stuff bringing oxygen down there. And they're saying that these things are not getting enough of it to go off in the resting state. So they're not giving you, this is a dark light organ. It's not doing anything. It's just sitting there like those fireflies I was passing around that weren't giving you any light. So what happens? Well, like I said, there's two theories. One is, well, they both agree on one other thing. The other thing they agree about is that all these things around the edges of the cells are mitochondria. And if you're not biologists, you probably don't care about mitochondria, but mitochondria are the energy producing things in our cells. Mitochondria take oxygen, use oxygen to manufacture ATP. ATP, as I said before, is the main chemical that provides energy to us no matter what we're doing. You got to have it, and you got to have oxygen to make it. Okay, and that has to take place in these mitochondria. Well, what these guys think is that those mitochondria are so busy making ATP that not enough oxygen gets into the interior of the cell, that the mitochondria, which are supposed to be producing energy for the cell, but they are going so fast at it that there's not enough oxygen getting to the interior of the cells for the light reaction to occur. So that's where their two different theories come up. One of them is that the nerve impulse comes down here, and this is the one I thought was going to be the final thing, but it isn't. That causes this thing to make nitric oxide, which comes over and inhibits the mitochondria so that the oxygen can get in. Remember, oxygen is the last step in the reaction. All you need, you had luciferin, luciferase, ATP, and when oxygen gets in there, you get light. So their theory is that you have to do something about these mitochondria in order to get light. And they think one theory is that it's you making nitric oxide, which inhibits the mitochondria briefly. You get a flash of light, and then the inhibition is gone away by that time. And so you're done. I don't know how they get two flashes in a row, but they didn't ask me. But anyway, and then there's another group that has cast some doubt on that theory, and they believe that maybe it's some other kind of change within the in cell that allows the oxygen. I mean, you got all this trachea around here, all of these oxygen carrying tubes. You don't have to make much difference in order to let them have oxygen get into the tissue.
My brain is thinking, well, maybe, sorry.
Maybe this is too simple, but the nerve is causing the trachea to contract and control the flow of oxygen. Has anyone thought about that?
Well, but it can't, it's opening up these, well, this cell, if it contracts, That would actually cut off the flow of oxygen.
Right, and that would stop the flash. And when it wants to flash, it opens it up.
Well, that would be basically one of those theories that the other people that say that nitric oxide doesn't work, they might be able to.
I wondered if anyone had thought of that.
Well, the other people talk about being an osmotic effect. They don't believe there are no muscle cells in the end cell, so there
Oh, so
wouldn't.
the
It really
trachea can't
probably isn't.
contract.
It probably isn't going to contract that way, but you know, we're beyond my pay grade at this point.
I think it was in your first video. I saw as the light flashed, the abdomen went down like that.
Well, that was a way that it would be on a specific firefly, I think is what you're talking about. For example, the one that goes like this, that guy that flashes, it's actually pointing down and then it's coming up. So I don't know that there's anywhere where it would go down the other direction.
I just wondered if there was anything a little more mechanical about moving the trachea. I don't know.
I don't know. And I
Okay.
have not seen anything that would tell me that, I mean, I haven't figured it out. They haven't figured it out, or maybe they have and I haven't found it, which is quite possible since it would be probably still out in original literature. And I had a little trouble getting a hold of all of that. Any other questions?
Bioluminescence is huge in the deep sea.
Mhm.
Are they studying the comparisons between the fireflies and land animals and the deep sea?
When they originally started talking about bioluminescence in general, fireflies were one example and all the critters in the ocean were other examples. And so they made up the same terms. It was still
Yeah.
luciferin, luciferase. And so you've got luciferin and luciferase in the ocean too, but they're not the same structures.
They're not the same chemicals?
No, they're not the
Oh,
same. They're not
interesting.
the same. I was going to finish up just a few minutes by just saying that a lot of what I found when I was looking things, oh boy, I'm done. I should be done. Okay, we'll just leave it there. I won't go any further unless you've got questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kay. You opened up a whole world for me.